Under the blazing afternoon sun of Maple Grove, one of Riverside County's most exclusive neighborhoods, a cry of prejudice and injustice shattered what should have been an ordinary, peaceful day, and that moment became a chain of events that no one could have predicted. It began with the piercing voice of Jane Mitchell, a well-known resident of the neighborhood, who looked upon a small child with suspicion not because of what she had done, but because of who she was. Jane shouted, "Arrest her, she doesn't belong here," and those words ignited a nightmare that transformed a safe street into a battlefield of injustice. Flashing police sirens soon echoed through the manicured lawns of Maple Grove as 3 officers arrived, not for criminals, not for danger, but for a 7-year-old girl named Betty Williams, who sat trembling on her bright pink bicycle clutching a worn unicorn named Star, her little eyes wet with tears, her tiny body shaking in confusion. The officers surrounded her like she was a threat, while Jane Mitchell folded her arms with a satisfied smirk, believing she had done something righteous. But in truth, she had set into motion a moment of cruelty that would expose the rotten underbelly of prejudice. Betty's trembling lips uttered the heartbreaking words, "I want my mommy," a plea that pierced through the hearts of neighbors who would later recount that they could never forget the sound of a child begging for her mother in the face of authority. The innocence of a child was shattered in that instant, but neither Jane nor the officers knew the storm of truth that was about to unravel. For Betty was not just any little girl. Her story, and her mother's story, would change everything and reveal just how wrong assumptions can be. To understand this moment, we must go back 45 minutes earlier, when Betty was simply being what every child deserves to be: curious, playful, and innocent. That morning, Betty wore her favorite purple dress, paired with her sparkly unicorn sneakers that lit up each time she walked. She was small for her age, with eyes so full of wonder that even the coldest heart could melt. Yet in this rich neighborhood, where houses cost more than most people earned in 5 years, Betty's joyful presence would be twisted into suspicion. Betty had only recently moved to Maple Grove with her mother, Sarah Williams, who wanted nothing more than to give her daughter a safe new beginning. They had already faced enough hardships. Sarah, at 38 years old, was not just any mother. She was Chief Sarah Williams, a decorated police chief, a woman who had climbed every rank in a system that doubted her at every turn. She had worked harder than anyone could imagine to protect others, yet in that moment she could not protect her own daughter from prejudice. Sarah had raised Betty alone since the day her husband, a dedicated soldier, was sent on his final deployment. He never returned, leaving behind only memories and the precious stuffed unicorn named Star that Betty now clutched to her chest as though it were the only shield against the cruelty surrounding her. Star represented her father's promise to always watch over her, even from heaven. Betty carried that unicorn everywhere because it gave her comfort and strength when she needed it most. That afternoon, as Betty rode her bicycle up and down the street, she marveled at butterflies fluttering near flower beds. She stopped to pick up pretty rocks to add to her little collection stored in a box under her bed. She dreamed of one day becoming a princess scientist who would discover new planets and maybe even find butterflies living among the stars. She was living in the pure wonder of childhood, completely unaware of the hatred brewing in the heart of a neighbor. Betty's crime that day was nothing more than curiosity. She had seen a colorful chalk drawing on the driveway of Jane Mitchell's home, and being a child, she pedaled closer to look at it. She wasn't touching anything, she wasn't trespassing, she was simply looking. But in the eyes of Jane Mitchell, Betty did not belong. Jane was a woman known in the neighborhood for her sharp tongue, her obsession with appearances, and her ability to make others feel unwelcome. She had long believed that Maple Grove should be reserved for people like her, and when she saw Betty, her thoughts darkened. She didn't see a child, she saw an outsider. Her prejudice twisted something innocent into something sinister. So Jane stepped outside, and in a voice laced with venom, shouted, "What are you doing here? You don't belong in this neighborhood." Betty froze, terrified. She had no idea what she had done wrong, but before she could explain, Jane pulled out her phone and called the police. She reported that a suspicious child was wandering near her house, and within minutes the sound of sirens cut through the quiet streets. When the officers arrived, they saw only what Jane told them to see. They did not see a child riding a bicycle holding a stuffed unicorn. They saw a problem to be handled: 3 grown men surrounding a 7-year-old girl, their hands resting on their belts, their expressions cold. Betty cried, clinging to Star, whispering, "I want my mommy," over and over again. Neighbors began to peek out from their windows, some even stepping outside. Confused by the scene unfolding before them, whispers spread. Why are the police surrounding a child? What could she possibly have done wrong? Yet Jane stood proud, pointing at Betty, saying, "I told you she doesn't belong here." Her words slicing like knives in the silence. But then the moment shifted. The officer's radio crackled with a name that would change everything. Chief Sarah Williams. When they learned that the child's mother was not only a resident, but the police chief of the entire department, the air grew heavy with realization and shame. Within minutes, a black SUV pulled up, and out stepped Sarah Williams in her full authority, her presence commanding and unshakable. She rushed to her daughter, dropping to her knees to hold Betty close, her voice soothing her tears, even as her eyes blazed with controlled fury at the sight before her. Sarah rose to her full height, holding Betty's hand and facing the officers who had treated her daughter like a criminal. She asked them a single question: what did she do? The silence that followed spoke volumes, for there was no answer, no crime, no reason, only prejudice. The truth was undeniable. The child had done nothing wrong, and yet her innocence had been shattered by bias, assumptions, and cruelty. Sarah turned her eyes on Jane Mitchell, who now shifted uncomfortably under the gaze of a woman she could not intimidate. Sarah's voice, calm yet thunderous, with authority, cut through the air. "My daughter belongs here more than your hate ever will." And with those words, the entire neighborhood began to see what had truly happened. This was not about safety. This was about racism. This was about a child being treated as less than because of the color of her skin. In the days that followed, the story of Betty Williams spread beyond Maple Grove. It reached news outlets, community leaders, and parents across the country. People were outraged. How could a 7-year-old be targeted like this? How could adults fail to see her innocence? Rallies were held demanding accountability for the officers and consequences for Jane Mitchell. But more importantly, the story forced people to confront the ugly truth that prejudice lives not just in the shadows, but sometimes in the brightest neighborhoods beneath the cleanest lawns. Betty's story became a symbol, a reminder of the terrible cost of judgment and the urgent need for compassion. Neighbors who had once ignored each other began to talk. Parents began teaching their children not just about kindness, but about courage to stand against injustice. And through it all, Betty held Star, a constant reminder of her father's promise, and now also a symbol of resilience. Betty eventually healed, though the memory would never fully fade. She learned that even when the world is cruel, love and truth will always shine brighter. Sarah continued her work as chief, but with renewed determination, vowing that no other child under her watch would ever face what Betty endured. And Jane Mitchell, once the woman who shouted arrest her, found herself isolated, her name remembered not for her wealth or her status, but for the day she exposed her heart of prejudice and lost the respect of an entire community. What began with a pink bicycle, a purple dress, and a stuffed unicorn ended as a story that shook a town and inspired thousands to say enough is enough. Injustice has no place in our streets, and the innocence of a child should never be sacrificed at the altar of hate. This is not just Betty's story. This is a story about all of us, about the kind of world we choose to build, a world where children can laugh, play, and dream without fear, and where no voice of hate can drown out the simple, powerful plea of a child saying, "I want my mommy," and if you stand against injustice, if you believe that no child should ever face what Betty did, then remember her story, share it, and be the change, because silence in the face of prejudice is complicity, but action, no matter how small, is justice in motion. Under the blazing afternoon sun of Maple Grove, a story unfolded that would etch itself into the collective memory of Riverside County and ripple far beyond its gated lawns. This was not the kind of story people expected to come from one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the state, with its pristine sidewalks, sparkling cars, and houses worth more than most people earned in a decade. Maple Grove was supposed to be a safe haven, a place where families could raise their children free from worry, but on this day the illusion shattered. The voice that started it all belonged to Jane Mitchell, a 45-year-old woman with bitterness in her heart and fear in her eyes. She stood on her driveway, arms crossed, her tone sharp and cold. "Arrest her, she doesn't belong here." Those words, directed at a 7-year-old girl, set in motion a chain of events that revealed the ugliness of prejudice in its rawest form. The child was Betty Williams, tiny, shy, and sweet, perched nervously on her bright pink bicycle, clutching a worn stuffed unicorn named Star to her chest. Star was her treasure, her comfort, the last gift from a father who had gone to war and never come home. It carried with it the warmth of bedtime stories, the sound of piggyback rides, and promises whispered by a man who would always watch over her from heaven. To see Betty that day was to see innocence. She wore her favorite purple dress and her sparkly unicorn sneakers that lit up with every step. Her small hands gripped the handlebars of her bike as tears streamed down her cheeks, but instead of being treated like the child she was surrounded by 3 police officers, their radios crackling, their belts heavy with authority, their eyes filled with suspicion. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, others stepped cautiously outside, confused by the sight of officers towering over a sobbing little girl. And through the noise, through the disbelief, Betty's small broken voice emerged. "I want my mommy." Those words carried more weight than any shout or siren. They pierced through the afternoon air like a blade. They captured the cruelty of the moment, a child forced to plead for comfort in a place that should have been her sanctuary. But before diving deeper into that heartbreaking moment, we must go back to understand how such an absurd tragedy could unfold. It begins with 3 people whose lives collided on this day: Betty Williams, her mother, Chief Sarah Williams, and Jane Mitchell, the woman who believed she was defending her neighborhood, but in truth exposed her own prejudice. Betty's story began in the tender glow of morning. That very same day, she had woken up filled with nervous excitement. It was her first day at Maple Grove Elementary. She had just moved into the neighborhood with her mother, and though she missed her old friends and her father, she was ready for this new chapter. Betty wanted to make her mother proud. Sarah had worked tirelessly to give her this chance. She dressed in her purple dress, slipped on her favorite sneakers, and tucked Star carefully into her backpack as if to carry her father's protection into the day. Sarah walked her daughter to school, holding her hand tightly along the manicured sidewalks. Maple Grove was everything Sarah had dreamed of for her child: safe streets, good schools, and opportunities she herself had never known. Growing up as one of only 3 Black women ever to hold the position of police chief in Riverside County, Sarah's journey had been anything but easy. She worked double shifts, sometimes 16 hours a day, balancing reports, crime scenes, and endless meetings, all while being a single mother. She faced skepticism at every step, whispers that she didn't belong in leadership, struggles to be taken seriously, and the heavy weight of knowing she had to be twice as good to earn half the respect. But Sarah was relentless. She wanted more for her daughter. She wanted Betty to grow up in a place where her dreams could soar without barriers. So she sacrificed, she pushed, she saved, until She could afford their home in Maple Grove. That morning she kissed Betty on the forehead at the school gates, whispered, "I'll pick you up after school," and drove off to one of the longest days of her career, a council meeting, a string of phone calls, reports that piled endlessly on her desk. She had no idea that while she sat in City Hall fighting for justice, her daughter would be stripped of it just a few streets away. Now to the second figure in this story, Jane Mitchell, once a woman with stability. She had watched her life unravel. Her husband left her after 2 decades of marriage for a younger woman. Her job slipped away, her savings dwindled, and her sense of self-worth fractured. She clung to the only thing left that gave her a feeling of control: her neighborhood. She dubbed herself the watchful eye of Maple Grove, inserting herself into everyone's business, timing when cars came and went, peering from behind curtains. She was the self-proclaimed neighborhood watch coordinator, though no one had given her the title. Bitterness and resentment festered within her, and when the Williams family arrived 2 weeks earlier, something darker awoke in her heart. Their presence, a hardworking Black mother and her sweet daughter, triggered fears and prejudices Jane had never confronted within herself. She began watching them, timing their comings and goings, scrutinizing who visited their home. She was not protecting her neighborhood. She was hunting for reasons to justify her prejudice. Betty was the third piece of this story, innocent, curious, unassuming. After a successful first day at school, she made a new friend named Emma who loved butterflies just like her. She spent recess laughing, chasing dreams, feeling for the first time since moving that she might belong. When school ended, she was brave enough to explore the neighborhood on her bicycle, the pink one her mother saved up for, the one her father would have been proud to see her riding. She pedaled slowly around the block, eyes fixed on the ground, searching for pretty rocks. Her father once taught her that every rock carried a story. If you looked closely enough, you could find treasures others overlooked. She carried a magnifying glass in her small backpack, a gift from her teacher that very morning. Her joy was pure, her purpose simple. But across the street, Jane Mitchell stood watching through her window. When she looked at Betty, she did not see innocence or curiosity. She saw something she despised, something she wanted removed. In her warped view, Betty was an intruder, an outsider who did not belong in her neighborhood. Jane stormed outside, shouted across the yard, "What are you doing here? You don't belong!" Betty, startled by the voice, froze. She clutched her unicorn tighter. But before she could explain, Jane reached for her phone, dialing the police. Her report was cold: a suspicious person near her home. Officers responded within minutes, sirens cutting through the quiet of Maple Grove. 3 men in uniform arrived, their presence heavy, their approach cautious but misplaced. They saw not a child, but a problem. Jane pointed a finger at Betty, repeating her venom, "I told you she doesn't belong here." The officers surrounded Betty, their shadows towering over her, the sparkle in her sneakers flashing as her legs shook. Her tears fell faster, her grip on Star tightened. She whimpered, "I want my mommy," her plea echoing down the street. Neighbors began stepping out, murmurs rising. Why would the police be called on a child? Confusion mixed with unease, yet none dared intervene until moments later a black SUV pulled up, its door flung open, and out stepped Sarah Williams, dressed in authority, radiating power and fury. She rushed to her daughter, falling to her knees, holding Betty close, whispering comfort as Betty buried her face into her mother's shoulder. Sarah then rose, facing the officers, her eyes blazing. She asked, "What did she do?" The silence was suffocating. There was no answer, no justification. The truth stood bare: a child had been targeted not for her actions, but for the color of her skin. Sarah turned her gaze to Jane Mitchell, her words sharp as steel, "My daughter belongs here more than your hate ever will." The neighborhood hushed, the illusion of safety shattered. The story did not end there. News of the incident spread rapidly. Neighbors told the tale, reporters picked it up, social media swarmed with outrage. How could officers be summoned to confront a Child on her bicycle, how could a neighbor weaponize prejudice against innocence? Protests rose, rallies demanded accountability. Jane, once a respected homeowner, became a symbol of disgrace, isolated even by those who once tolerated her gossip. She had revealed her heart, and it was ugly. Sarah, meanwhile, became a national figure, not just as a police chief, but as a mother forced to watch her daughter suffer the very injustice she dedicated her life to fighting. She spoke to the press, her words deliberate. This is not about one child, this is about every child who deserves to be safe, every family who deserves to belong. Betty healed slowly, her nights filled with nightmares, her days with cautious glances over her shoulder, but with her mother's love and the support of newfound friends. She began to laugh again, to ride her bicycle again, to carry Star proudly on her adventures. She understood in her own small way that what happened to her was wrong, but she also learned that love and truth were stronger than hate. Maple Grove itself changed. Neighbors who once ignored each other began speaking, building bonds. Parents taught their children not just kindness, but courage, the courage to speak against wrong, the courage to stand for what was right. Jane faded into obscurity, remembered only for the day she let prejudice dictate her actions, but Betty's story endured. It became a lesson, a reminder that evil can wear ordinary faces, that injustice can strike in the quietest neighborhoods, and that even the smallest voice crying for her mommy can spark a movement against hate. And so the story of Betty, Sarah, and Jane lives on, not as a tale of despair, but as a beacon calling us all to do better, to be better, because the innocence of a child is too precious to ever be sacrificed at the altar of prejudice, and when faced with injustice, silence is not an option. Under the golden glow of the late afternoon sun in Maple Grove, a story of innocence and cruelty collided in a way that would scar the community forever. The neighborhood, with its manicured lawns, rows of luxury cars, and tall gates, was built on an illusion of safety, but beneath the surface, prejudice, bitterness, and fear simmered, waiting for a spark to ignite it. That spark came in the form of a 7-year-old girl, Betty Williams. Her bright pink bicycle leaned carefully against the community mailboxes at the end of Maple Street, her sparkly unicorn sneakers lit up as she knelt on the mulch, her tiny hands brushing through leaves and soil until her fingers closed around something smooth and shiny. She pulled it out, her eyes widening in wonder. It was the most beautiful rock she had ever seen, glistening in the light with tiny crystals that sparkled like diamonds. Her heart filled with pure joy. This was exactly the kind of treasure her daddy told her to look for before he left for his final military deployment, a mission he never returned from. Betty's father always told her every rock has a story. If you look closely enough, you'll find beauty in the places most people ignore. Clutching her magnifying glass, a gift from her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, that very morning Betty studied the rock with delight. Through the lens, she could see the tiny crystals up close, each glimmer reminding her of the stories her father once told her. She giggled, the sound of pure childhood wonder filling the air. She imagined her daddy watching from heaven, smiling, proud that she remembered his lessons about finding treasures in unexpected places. In that moment, Betty wasn't just looking at a rock, she was holding a piece of her father's love and carrying forward the dreams he had planted in her heart. But what Betty did not know was that across the street, hidden behind blinds, a pair of eyes watched her every move. Jane Mitchell, a woman whose life had been broken by betrayal, stood at her window peering like a predator stalking prey. For 2 weeks, she had observed the Williams family, timing their comings and goings, whispering judgments into the empty silence of her lonely house. When she saw Betty kneeling near the mailbox, her heart hardened. She didn't see a child lost in wonder, she saw a threat. Her mind, twisted by bitterness and prejudice, spun a story darker than reality. Why is she digging around the mailboxes? What is she hiding? What is she really doing here? Jane convinced herself she had Finally found proof the Williams family didn't belong. She snapped her blinds shut and marched out of her house with the fury of someone desperate to be proven right, each step heavy and sharp on the pavement, her eyes locked on Betty, who was still smiling at her rock. Completely unaware of the storm heading her way. "What are you doing digging around our mailboxes?" Jane's voice cracked like a whip across the peaceful afternoon. Betty, startled, nearly dropped her magnifying glass. She looked up. Her first instinct was to share her joy the way all children do when they discover something wonderful. She held up the sparkling rock, her smile radiant. "Look what I found. My daddy taught me to look for special rocks," he said. "Every rock has a story if you look close enough." Her voice trembled with excitement, her innocence glowing through each word. But Jane's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed thin. She didn't see wonder, she saw intrusion. Without hesitation, she snatched the rock from Betty's small hand. The joy vanished from Betty's face, replaced with confusion and fear. "That's my treasure," Betty whispered softly. "I found it fair and square. My daddy taught me." Jane cut her off with venom. "I don't care what your daddy taught you. You don't belong here. This is a good neighborhood. We don't have children running around unsupervised digging through our property." The words stung Betty like icy rain. She didn't understand why this woman was so angry, why her treasure had been taken away, why she was being told she didn't belong. She clutched her unicorn star tighter, her eyes filling with tears. She whispered again in a breaking voice, "My daddy said every rock has a story." But Jane turned away unmoved, and in her bitterness, she reached for her phone, dialing the police and reporting a suspicious person in the neighborhood. She didn't tell them it was a child. She didn't mention the pink bicycle or the stuffed unicorn. She painted Betty as something to fear. To understand why Jane reached this point, we must step back 6 months earlier to the moment her own world collapsed. Jane had once lived what seemed like a picture-perfect life, a comfortable marriage, a respectable job, a beautiful home built with her husband Robert. But one evening, everything shattered. Robert came home and announced he was leaving. He was in love with his 28-year-old secretary. He wanted a divorce. He wanted a new life. Without Jane, the words ripped through her like glass. She lost her husband, her friends, their shared house, even her sense of self-worth. She was left with bitterness, clinging to her mother's small inherited home like a lifeline. Not long after she lost her job at the bank where she had worked for 15 years. Budget cuts, they said. But Jane knew the truth. At 45, she was no longer wanted, too bitter, too broken to compete with the younger employees. Everything she had built dissolved until all she had left was her neighborhood. Maple Grove became her last source of control. She declared herself its watchful protector, taking notes of every car, every visitor, every child who played outside. She convinced herself she was defending the neighborhood, but in reality she was projecting her own pain onto others. And when the Williams family moved in, her prejudice found a target. Sarah Williams, a black woman, a police chief, a single mother, represented everything Jane had lost: strength, success, family. And Betty represented everything Jane no longer had: innocence, joy, dreams. Jane's anger twisted into cruelty, and now standing before a 7-year-old girl clutching a unicorn and crying, she let that cruelty spill into action. As Betty's tears fell, sirens soon pierced the afternoon. 3 police cars rolled into Maple Grove. Neighbors stepped out in confusion. 3 officers approached, surrounding the little girl who still held her unicorn tighter than ever, her voice small and broken. "I want my mommy." The officers towered over her, hands resting on their belts, listening to Jane's cold words. "I told you. She doesn't belong here, Betty." And authority radiating more power than their sirens, she demanded, "What did she do?" The silence was heavy. No one answered, because there was no answer. No crime had been committed, only prejudice, only fear. Sarah's gaze cut through the officers and locked onto Jane, her voice sharp as steel. "My daughter belongs here more than your hate ever will." The neighborhood froze. The illusion of safety crumbled. The truth was undeniable. This wasn't about mailboxes or rocks. This was about racism, about assumptions, That turned a child's afternoon into a nightmare. The story didn't end on Maple Street. It exploded across Riverside County and beyond. News outlets ran the headline, "Police called on 7-year-old for playing outside." National reporters arrived. Community leaders demanded answers. Protests filled the city square. People held signs that read, "Let children be children," and "Justice for Betty." The officers involved were placed under investigation. Jane Mitchell, once a respected figure in the neighborhood, became an outcast. Her name remembered not for her wealth, but for the ugliness of her actions. Neighbors avoided her. Her phone calls unanswered. Her bitterness consuming her in isolation. Sarah stood before cameras and crowds, not just as a police chief, but as a mother. Her words steady, but full of fire. "This is not just about my daughter. This is about every child who deserves to feel safe in their neighborhood. This is about families who deserve to belong. This is about the cost of silence in the face of prejudice." Betty slowly healed. She returned to school. Her friend Emma stayed by her side. Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, encouraged her curiosity, reminding her that rocks and butterflies still held beauty. She carried her magnifying glass proudly again, and though she never forgot the fear of that day, she learned resilience. She learned that her voice mattered, that her mommy would always protect her. Maple Grove, too, began to change. Neighbors who once ignored each other began speaking. Parents taught their children to see differences as beauty, not threats. Jane faded into the background, her power gone, her voice silenced by her own cruelty. Betty's story became a lesson shared in classrooms, churches, and town halls, a reminder that prejudice can strike anywhere, that even the smallest child can be turned into a target by hate, and that justice begins when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. And so the story of Betty Williams, the girl with the pink bicycle, the sparkly unicorn sneakers, and the stuffed unicorn named Star, lives on, not just as a tragedy, but as a call to action, a reminder that every child deserves to dream without fear, every mother deserves to raise her child without prejudice, and every community must choose whether to let hate rule or to stand for love and justice, because in the end, the innocence of a child is more powerful than the bitterness of hate. And when a little girl whispers, "I want my mommy," the whole world should listen.